All right, welcome back to C Files, folks. I'm in a reading marathon tonight, and I'm going to finish this book up before I go have supper. So here we go. I just finished reading number 38. This will be reading number 39, and hopefully the last one. And I will go to the other books that I've been reading, including a devotion time in the Bible and a study of comparative religions. And so let's continue on. Now, we were just reading about the situation in the South after the Civil War, and the slaves were freed, and then the circumstance of the former white former slave owners, I should say it that way, having economic difficulty because the former slaves didn't want to go back to work for them with menial contracts, and may have been organizing against them. That was the speculation as we finished the reading. So let me pick up on the paragraph I read formally to get a context, and then we'll continue on through the end of this chapter and then the epilogue. It also indicated that the freedmen might be politically organized. Whites tended to interpret the hopes of the freedmen as aggressive and threatening, a sign that they were ready to turn to violence. And whites, like blacks, looked to the Christmas season as a time when matters would finally come to a head. Interpretations varied as to precisely how and for what reason violence would break out. Some whites thought it would happen spontaneously. An Atlanta newspaper warned that the holiday might start out as a frolic, but it would soon turn into something considerably more menacing. Emboldened by alcohol and encouraged by bad white men, the blacks could be easily persuaded to commit outrage and violence. A planter from South Carolina told a visiting reporter that some families will be murdered and some property destroyed, and he concluded ominously, I will begin the work of extermination. Or not I, it will begin the work of extermination. The fears of the one race coming led in a volatile fashion. Excuse me. The pollen has been getting me, but I do want to finish this up. Here we go. The fears of the one race coming led in a volatile fashion with the hopes of the other. As December approached, an increasing number of Southern whites became convinced that the freedmen were actively plotting an organized insurrection. All across the South, apprehensions of such an insurrection during the Christmas holidays were reported and spread by newspapers. In mid November, a Louisiana newspaper reported that there is an increasing dread of what may turn up in the future. The N word are, by some means, procuring arms and are daily coming more insolent. Toward the end of the month, the Cincinnati Daily Inquirer headlined the story: A derogatory N word conspiracy discovered in Mississippi, and explained that a conspiracy had been organized among the blacks extending from the Mississippi River to South Carolina, and that an insurrection was contemplated about Christmas. Such stories were printed and reprinted by newspapers throughout the South. Some of the rumors were quite detailed. A letter printed in the New Orleans True Delta received a reliable report that blacks would collectively revolt on the night before Christmas and wreak their vengeance on whites whose names had already been chosen. The victims were to be identified to their attackers by signs and marks placed on each house and placed on businesses. These marks would consist of coded numbers as well as the letters X and O set in chalk marks. It was largely to the Freedmen's Bureau that there fell the task of persuading the freedmen that Christmas would not be ushering in Jubilee, that further disruption of the Southern economy would harm them as well as blacks, that the signing of labor contracts was now their best available recourse, and that insurrection would be futile. Under orders from President Johnson himself, the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, General O. Howard, spent the late fall touring the South in order to communicate these points. On November the 12th, General Hall sent a policy statement to his staff. It is constantly reported to the commissioner and to his agents that the freedmen have been deceived as to the intentions of the government. It is said that lands will be taken from the present holders and be divided among them on next Christmas or New Year's. This impression, wherever it exists, is wrong. All officers and agents of the Bureau are hereby directed to take every possible means to remove so erroneous and injurious an impression. They will further endeavor to overcome other false reports that have been industriously spread abroad with a purpose to unsettle labor and give rise to disorder and suffering. Every proper means will be taken to secure fair written agreements or contracts for the coming year, and the freedmen instructed that it is for their best interest to look to the property holders for employment. On another occasion, General Howard warned the freedmen directly that there would be no division of lands, that nothing is going to happen at Christmas, that you must go to work and make contracts for next year. Insurrection will lead to nothing but your destruction. Most agents of the Bureau dutifully, if reluctantly, pass along the word that the freedmen's Christmas hopes were nothing but a pipe dream, or as a Memphis newspaper put it, a la mode Santa Claus. Colonel William E. Strong, the Bureau's Inspector General, addressed a group of Texas freedmen in plain language. I have been sent here from Washington to make a speech to the colored people. I have little to say, and that is in plain words. Winter is coming on. Go back to your former masters. Work and be obedient and show that you are worthy of freedom. You expect the government to divide your late master's lands out to you. And about the 1st of January, you will get buggies and carriages, but you are mistaken. You will not get a cent. It all belongs to the former owners, and you will not get anything unless you work for it. It is true that rations have been given to some of you, but you will not get any more. You have had good masters, I know. I have been through here long enough to find out for myself. But white Southerners are skeptical about whether such a cautionary message would be heeded by the black community. What was needed, one newspaper argued, in a sarcastic reference to the abolitionist leanings and the New England background of many Freedmen's Bureau officials, was straight talk from imposing men who were born at least 1,000 miles distant from Cape Cod. Of course, the planters themselves reiterated the message to their ex-slaves. But the slaves would not heed their warnings either. As one Mississippi newspaper conceded, it amounts to nothing for former masters and mistresses to read these orders to inward, derogatory. They do not believe anything we can tell them. Some whites conspicuously manipulated the fear of an insurrection as a way of convincing state and federal authorities to allow slave whites to rearm themselves and to disarm and harass the freedmen. An Alabama official used just such an argument in a letter to the governor of that state. I am anxious to organize the local company. It is feared the N-word will be troublesome about Christmas unless there is some organization that can keep them in subjection. Many whites were truly fearful. The mistress of one plantation near Columbia, South Carolina, later recalled how she was terrified by the nocturnal singing that came from what until recently had been her slave cabins. Singing that evoked expectations of horrid pouring into our houses to cut our throats and dance like fiends over our remains. It is possible that some African Americans were intend harboring thoughts, if not making plans, of a Christmas revolt. But those plans could hardly have amounted to a coordinated conspiracy. What is far more likely is an explanation that places both white fears and black hopes in the context of the intense expectations that normally surrounded Christmas on the slave plantations. For if Christmas was a time when slaves expected gestures of paternalist largesse, it was also a time when they were used to acting up. In that sense, the Atlanta paper may have been shrewd in suggesting that the Christmas insurrection might begin as a frolic. What was happening in late 1865 was that a serious, contested set of political and economic issues, issues involving the radical redistribution of property and a radical realignment of power, chanced to converge with a holiday season whose ordinary rituals had always pointed, however symbolically, to just such a redistribution of property and just such a realignment of power. On both sides of the color line, there was a shared mythos about Christmas that made the holiday loom with ominous weight in the watershed year of white defeat and black emancipation. There was no insurrection. Confrontations, yes, even in a number of cities, violent riots. The most serious of these was in Alexandria, Virginia, where two people were killed. But it soon transpired that the Alexandria riot was actually initiated by whites and that both victims were black. By December 28 or 29, it was clear that the danger had subsided. The Ides of Christmas are past. One Southerner paper proclaimed, without any insurrection of the colored population of the late slave-holding states, there is no probability of any combination of freedmen for hostile purposes. Neither are they likely to combine at present for political or industrial objects. Another paper simply reported that some cases of collusion or collision, between blacks and whites occurred on Christmas, but there was no organized demonstration on the part of the former. It was now possible to reinterpret the events of December 25th, to put them back into the old, familiar antebellum categories. Newspapers reassured their readers that such collisions as did occur were isolated events, and that they were not even political in nature, but merely a function of old-fashioned Christmas rowdiness, occasional occasioned by alcohol, not ideology. The Virginia correspondent of a Washington newspaper reported with relief that a few brawls in Norfolk and Portsmouth were the result of whiskey and had no political significance whatsoever. Too much whiskey, claimed one paper. Much bad whiskey, added another. Some colored men very much under the influence of bad whiskey, chimed in a third. And the newspapers now reported arrests of drunkenness and disorderly conduct by placing their notices in the police log, not the political columns. The racial identity of the offenders now hardly mattered. On December 27, the Richmond Daily Whig reported that Christmas was celebrated in this city with unprecedented hilarity. It was more a street than a home celebration. King Alcohol asserted his sway and held possession of the town from Christmas Eve until yesterday morning. Liquor and firecrackers had everything their own way. A disposition was manifested to make up for lost time. This was the first real old-fashioned Christmas frolic that has been enjoyed in the South for 4 years. The pent-up dissipations and festivities of 4 Christmas days were crowded into this one day. By December 29, the New Orleans Picayune even chose to use humor as a way of marginalizing the racial content of the violence that had indeed erupted in that city on Christmas Day. Under the heading, "Everyone ought to be eloquent in his own defense," the paper reported that one white man arrested on Christmas for rowdy behavior testified in his defense, "Your Honor, I am charged with being a distributor of the peace. It is a mistake, Your Honor. I have kept more than 100 blank, derogatory term, off the streets this Christmas times. May it please Your Honor, I have a bad cold." The man's case was dismissed. Oh my goodness. The crisis had passed, and it was now possible for white Southerners to return to the underlying problem: the collective refusal of the freedmen to work for their old masters. And that would take care of itself. The New Orleans Daily Picayune, or Picayune, explained, as the freedmen came to understand that their true friends were the Southern planter class and not the Northern demagogues who had falsely promised them land. When that truth at last dawned upon them, it inevitably would, as it inevitably would, they will learn where to learn their own true interest and duty. The same editorial went on to explain bluntly just what that would mean. As the season passes by, without bringing them the possessions they coveted and the license to be idle, which they expected with them, and they learned that they must look for support to themselves, for the government will decline to help those who do not help themselves. The relations of labor to capital will begin to be freed from one of the most perplexing of the elements that have kept them unsettled, and to adjust themselves upon the natural basis of the mutual dependence of planter and freedman on justice to each other for their mutual prosperity. In other words, the freedmen would soon be forced back into virtual slavery. A newspaper enrichment even resorted to a nostalgic evocation of the old interracial Christmas rituals, along with a rueful acknowledgement that the planters were unable to perform the role of patrons in the gift exchange. Not only would the freedmen fail to receive their master's land, but they might even have to do without the usual presents they customarily receive on this occasion. But that was an aberration, indicating only that the planters were temporarily impoverished and not that race relations had changed. Henceforth, every one of these 4 millions of beings expected and received a Christmas present and partook of the master's good cheer. Now, alas, that former master is penniless, and he who depended upon his bounty as a homeless wanderer. The warm blanket, the cheerful fire, the substantial fare, the affectionate greetings, and the gifts they have been accustomed to receive at the hands of the old and young will, we fear, be sadly missed. The Richmond editor summed up the prospect by referring to the eclipse of an old tradition. The familiar salutation of Christmas gift master will not be heard. But the real object of this nostalgia was the master's loss, not the disappointment of his former slaves. That point came across clearly enough in the editor's concluding shot, an expression of hope that in another year or so, things would be back to normal for the freedmen, that their future condition may be better than their condition is at present, and that the next Christmas may dawn upon a thrifty, contented, and well regulated inward peasantry. Even now, with the Civil War lost and the black population legally free, the capital city of the Confederacy continued to link rituals of Christmas misrule with the maintenance of the antebellum racial hierarchy. A contented and well regulated derogatory inward peasantry was, after all, just what was needed to sustain a prosperous class of white planters. The cry of Christmas gift would be music to their ears. Folks, the last two readings have been quite painful to read through because the first having to avoid all of the references to the N word, and then second, the attitudes that are displayed here. It's just disturbing. Oh, I want to say something that's in my mind. I have to be careful here, but I'm going to go ahead and say it because it needs to be said. Much of this attitude on the behalf of whites toward blacks during that time did not come from the Bible, did not come from this book. It came from a different book I have over here on the shelf called The Descent of Man by Charles Darwin. That was one of the major roots of racism in our country. And those of you who almost worship Darwin, you might want to go back and read that book and think about that. Okay, I'm just going to leave it there. Now let's get into the epilogue. I'll go ahead and do the epilogue, and then we'll finish up this book and continue on with others. I detest racism, and I detest Darwin's racism in his book. Epilogue. The Ghost of Christmas Past. Christmas in Tuskegee. It was a cry of Christmas gift that awakened Booker T. Washington one night in 1880. That first winter in Tuskegee, Alabama. But the cry was not music to his ears. Washington and his wife first realized that the holiday season had arrived when, past midnight on Christmas Eve, local black children began rapping at our doors asking for Christmas gifts, Christmas gifts. The visits continued almost without pause until dawn. Between the hours of 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning, I presume we must have had 100 such calls. Those calls were merely a foretaste of the holiday week to come, a week that, as Washington put it, gave us an opportunity to get a further insight into the real life of the people. And Booker T. Washington did not like what he learned. We found that for a whole week, the colored people in and around Tuskegee dropped work the day before Christmas and that it was difficult to get anyone to perform any service from that time. They stopped work until after the new year. Persons who at other times did not use strong drink thought it quite the proper thing to indulge in it freely during the Christmas week. There was a widespread hilarity and a free use of guns, pistols, and gunpowder generally. Then there were frolics held every night at Christmas week, every night of Christmas week in one of the cabins that once had served as slave quarters on the local plantation. Washington described the frolics as a kind of rough dance, where there was likely to be a good deal of whiskey used, excuse me, and where there might be some shooting or cutting with razors. Perhaps redundantly, he added, the sacredness of the season seemed to have been almost wholly lost sight of. In one cabin, I noticed that all that the in one cabin, I noticed that all that the five children had to remind them of the coming of Christ as a signal bunch of firecrackers which they had divided among them. In still another family, I found another. I found nothing but a new jug of whiskey, which the husband and wife were making free use of, notwithstanding the fact that the husband was one of the local ministers. In other homes, some member of the family had bought a new pistol. In a majority of the cases, there was nothing to be seen in the cabin to remind one of the coming of the Savior, except that the people had ceased work in the fields and were lounging about their homes. Excuse my throat. The lounging about may have bothered Washington more than anything else. He even encountered an old black preacher, an old local black preacher, who tried to convince me from the experience Adam had in the Garden of Eden that God had cursed all labor, and that therefore it was a sin for any man to work. Washington recognized the irony of the situation. The old preacher was supremely happy during Christmas week because he was living, as he expressed it, through 1 week that was free from sin. Familiar material. Nor was Booker T. Washington the first African American to criticize it. In slavery days, many black people, from pious Baptists and Methodists to secular radicals like Frederick Douglass, had decried the carnival aspects of the slave Christmas, arguing that it demeaned those who engaged in it. Washington, too, understood that these practices were the lingering residue of slavery, but he managed to conclude the story he told on a happier note. In fact, Washington used his account of that first Christmas in Tuskegee to introduce a chapter devoted to the profound change he was able to produce in the character and habits of poor young black men who attended the famous college he established there. Washington went on to show the contrast between what he experienced in 1880 and the kind of Christmas celebration that he introduced to his students in Tuskegee. The transformation of Christmas was a paradigm of the larger changes he had set out to accomplish. In the school, we made a special effort to teach our students the meaning of Christmas and to give them lessons in its proper observance. In this, we have been successful to a degree that makes me feel safe in saying that the season now has a new meaning, not only through all the immediate region, but in a measure wherever our graduates have gone. At the present time, one of the most satisfactory features of the Christmas and Thanksgiving seasons at Tuskegee is the unselfish and beautiful way our graduates and students spend their time in ministering to the comfort and happiness of others, especially the unfortunate. Booker T. Washington may have been exaggerating a little, but his success as an educator and administrator leaves little room to doubt the fundamental reality of his claim. A Tuskegee education meant both a change of behavior and an interior change of spirit, a reformation that Washington hoped would allow his students to integrate into mainstream American society. As, as Washington understood when he wrote his 1901 autobiography, Up from Slavery, Christmas provided an apt and powerful symbol of that very reformation. And it provides us with an interesting reminder. A reminder that such a reform could and did originate within the African American community itself. It is easy to think of the suppression of the carnival Christmas only as something that was imposed from outside, but this wasn't the case. The suppression also came from within. Booker T. Washington's students came to Tuskegee in the depressing post-Reconstruction years that witnessed the emergence of Jim Crow as members of a demeaned and betrayed group of Americans. They had little to risk and a world to gain, but learning the skills and the values associated with respectable white society, including an appreciation of a new meaning for Christmas. In hindsight, there is something poignant about their efforts. We now know that even educated African Americans were unable to achieve the respect and security that Booker T. Washington staked his career on providing. And to us, what they lost in the process of reforming themselves may be more valuable than what they gained. But we should not doubt that for Washington and his students, learning a new meaning for Christmas seemed a form of empowerment. Suppression from outside was the most dramatic vehicle by which the old Christmas traditions came to an end. It was not the only one, but it was not the only one. Next, we're going to read. Oh my goodness. How are we doing? Okay, we'll finish it. Try to. What time we got? I've got to go eat, folks. I got to have some supper. I tried to get it in this reading. It looks like number 40 is going to be the last reading. And I'm going to have to get it done tonight. Yeah. So in the next reading, it's going to be John Canoe and the Reen Boys. Thanks for watching. And this is the epilogue. This is not the last chapter. It's the very last epilogue of the book. So maybe I can pick up on this in a different time to finish reading it. Because technically we have finished the book. But I like what's going on here in this portion. Take what I've read so far and think about it. Because we should really, really think about what history teaches us. God bless you guys. I will see you next time when I come back to read. And I'll have more marathons coming. Good book. Good book. Very raw and very real. I recommend it. We'll see you next time here on the C Files.